Hi, Allison. Welcome to the All's Authors podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. We've been really looking forward to talking to you about your book, Stand By Me, and learning all about your journey with your dad.
I am excited to meet you too, and I am excited to hear so much about your book and about you and what you're doing now because you are really doing a lot of work that I think many of our listeners will appreciate and benefit from. So maybe you can start off by telling us a little bit about how you came to write your book, Stand By Me, and then we can go from there.
Sure. So I am a clinical psychologist by training. For the past 15 years, I've worked in the field of psycho-oncology, which is a field that unites cancer care and mental health care. And when I was beginning my work in psycho-oncology in 2010, I was working primarily with patients with advanced life-limiting cancers at the end of their lives. And what was so striking to me about working with these patients was, as opposed to their focusing on their own mortality, they would be focusing on their parents and partners and children and siblings and friends. The folks who were in the waiting rooms waiting for them, the folks left at home, individuals who they were telling me were really the centerpiece of their care, and the people who'd be most deeply impacted by their eventual deaths. This was, long before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I realized back then that cancer care specifically, but healthcare more broadly, was deeply reliant on family caregivers to shoulder tremendous responsibilities. And even despite the fact that way back then, the scientific literature had already very well documented distress in caregivers, there were no targeted support services for caregivers in any cancer center or any hospital system in our country. And so in 2011, I founded the Caregivers Clinic at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which was the first targeted psychosocial care program for family caregivers in a cancer center, and led that service for over a decade. What many of my patients were not aware of, or I would say none of my patients were aware of, is that the same year that I founded the Caregivers Clinic, I'd stepped into the caregiver role for my father, Stanley Applebaum, who had Lewy Body Disease. And so was juggling both professionally leading this clinical service and really spearheading efforts in the United States to support family caregivers while behind the scenes living a very intense, challenging caregiving journey. The cliff notes of what inspired the writing is after my father's death in 2019, I would say primarily about a year after we were in lockdown, and I was not only still deep in my own grief, but I was also facing a deeper existential distress professionally, which is that I and my colleagues were only scratching the surface in terms of supporting family caregivers. I mean, we had a wait list that was many months long in the Caregivers Clinic, which is not surprising. Of course, the pandemic was incredibly challenging for all of us, but particularly for family caregivers. And yet there was so very little that we all could do despite having the expertise and the infrastructure that we had. And so a big motivation to write Stand By Me was my desire to give the training and education and support and validation that caregivers would receive should they come to our Caregivers Clinic, and make it accessible to the 53 million caregivers in the country today who are not necessarily able to access high quality psychosocial care.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, so true. There's just, I particularly am picking up on that comment at the beginning of, even though it's well documented in the literature that caregivers, there are detrimental effects for them, so mental, physical, all kinds of things. There aren't these services available.
Exactly.
It's astounding. Yeah.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you, when you came up with the idea to start this clinic, what steps did you have to go through, or hoops that you had to jump through to make it a reality? Because I don't, were the people there just immediately saying, wow, what a great idea, let's do this?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, have you worked in a hospital system? Do you know anything about healthcare right now? If anything was that easy, we might be having a different conversation. No, Many steps that I took, which I actually made very concrete. I published a toolkit with the American Cancer Society last year to actually spell out all the steps that I took so that others can do that. I can talk more about that later on. But, the steps that I took included speaking to leadership about the importance of family caregivers, their role in cancer care, really emphasizing that the presence of a well-supported, educated, willing family caregiver could make the difference between life or death, could make the difference financially for the institution, which is, of course, what administrators like to hear. And there was one step that I took that I think was really the one that tipped the scales and gave enthusiasm for me to do this. And that is that I advocated that we would register caregivers to become patients of the healthcare system. Meaning, if I pretend I'm as my dad's daughter, as the caregiver, I would then register to become a patient of Memorial Sloan Kettering. That's not where he received care, but just for example. And having my own medical record and my own medical record number, would that mean that I could be billed for services, which meant that we had a model for a clinical service that would generate revenue for the institution. And that was one of the key steps that really led to enthusiasm on the part of the institution for the service.
Wow, that's fascinating. So if a patient then registers with Sloan Kettering, are they then starting to be charged if they see you and see and do they have insurance that covers that cost? They're
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not out of pocket.
It's not out of pocket.
Got it.
That we don't want to incur, add to the financial burden. We know financial toxicity is extreme. I don't need to go into the numbers for this audience. You all know. So the idea is that we can then bill caregivers unique insurance.
Got it.
And what we have found is using typical psychotherapy codes, we've actually had no issue in getting reimbursement. Now, certainly the reimbursement for a provider such as myself is not as high as a medical oncologist, but nonetheless, for caregivers, they have been able to get care. And for those who don't have insurance, often what we've done is we've had them work with trainees who are supervised by licensed clinical psychologists who then can see them pro bono. So we've had mechanisms to provide care free of charge.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah. I had a question. When I worked at the hospital here in upstate New York, where I worked, they had support groups. I actually ran one at one time, and the support groups were held in a building outside of the hospital because it was a philosophy that the people didn't want to go to the hospital. It was a negative experience. And I think it was Patty Davis, who is one of our authors. They held her support groups were held inside the hospital because the administration wanted to bring the people into the hospital so that they could show their hospital or make people feel comfortable. So where were your meetings held? Were they in the hospital itself or outside?
The first thing I'll say is that our clinical service rarely provided group psychotherapy. And I say that, I make a point to say that because we heard from many caregivers got referred to us after participating in what are called drop-in groups, which are not structured and open-ended, and any caregiver can attend any week. And often caregivers would share with us that they felt very unheld and it was chaotic for them. So they really wanted the individual support that we provide. All of our individual support through the pandemic was provided in person at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. However, the counseling center within which we were housed was physically separated from the hospital. It was a Sloan Kettering floor of a building, but it didn't look like a hospital. In fact, it looked like a business building. And I do think psychologically there was something protective about that, for sure. I will say since February of 2020, March of 2020, all care has been virtual. And it's remained as such. And we, in part because most caregivers have said to us, it is just a lot easier for us to not have to make another trip in and not pay for transportation. And there are certain cases where we would require in-person visits if, God forbid, a caregiver was suicidal or experiencing severe psychopathology. But barring that, which is quite rare, it's been a real gift, I think, the reliance on telehealth and telemedicine. And let's just hope reimbursement for these mechanisms remains.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. And I think that takes into account the realities of being a caregiver, that you might not have 30 minutes to get somewhere and then be there for X number of minutes and then another 30-minute drive. And it could be 45, 50 by the time you leave. That's a lot. And so that's why things like this podcast and our YouTube channel are so vital to so many people, because they can access it when they have opportunity. Yeah. And they're not in the midst of something. And it just, I think, and books, same thing. You can access those at your opportunities. And so that's really important. So I think telehealth has been leans into that in a way that is so great for people. Yeah. One question I had for you is, in your experience then, as a psychotherapist doing work with oncology, caregivers for people with cancer, and then your own experience caring for your dad, what parallels did you find and what differences did you find?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I'll share a little bit also about some shifts in my career, actually, recently that are related to this. So, some of the parallels, cancer caregiving, in many cases, this is a broad stroke stereotype, but it's borne out in the data. And this is from data from the National Cancer Institute. The cancer caregiving experience is typically very intense and very episodic, meaning there's an intense 3-month period or an intense year, and then it's resolved, or there's a period of survivorship or sort of a lull. So there's high intensity for shorter periods of time, versus caring for an individual with any flavor of dementia is a much more long haul caregiving journey. And it's not to say there are not moments of incredible intensity. Certainly when my dad was first diagnosed and his first year was 10 out of 10 on the intensity scale. But then there were years that were less so. And I think that's common. One of the commonalities between dementia caregiving across the board and caregiving for patients either with brain tumors or neurocognitive effects of cancer or treatment are obviously the neurocognitive changes that happen. And the reason I highlight these is that those really shape the caregiving experience. And that's where I see the big difference. I would say taking care of a patient with a glioblastoma, which is a devastating brain tumor, has some similarities to taking care of someone with advanced Alzheimer's disease, but it's drastically different from taking care of someone with breast cancer who has no metastases to the brain. And so there are some situations where there are commonalities where, very often caregivers are tasked with taking responsibility for healthcare communication because patients are unable to do so. That often happens in the setting of cancer care, but not because so much time has gone by, instead because the tumor is either in the brain or the treatment is affecting brain functioning. So there's some commonalities, some differences, but I would say the biggest difference is really the time span. On average, I shouldn't say on average because I don't know the most recent stat, but it's under 5 years would be, under even 2.5 years, I think, for the average cancer caregiving journey. Whereas in the setting of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Lewy Body Disease and frontotemporal dementia and all these others, we know that it's much, much longer. And so what that tells us, though, is that support for caregivers is critical because this is a ultra marathon.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I maybe we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about your father, Stanley Applebaum.
My favorite topic.
I'm sure. What really struck me is that he was almost 60 years older than you. So, you're much younger, like coming into the dementia journey than most people are, with a parent. Parents usually that age, 60, when they might have to care for a parent. So, tell us a little bit about that, what he was like growing up and his career, and the way that you use the song titles and the chapter headings.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Love that.
Yeah.
So, I can cover all that. So my dad, Stanley Applebaum, was a very well-known musician. He was a composer, orchestrator, arranger, and conductor. He worked with many of the big artists of the 50s and 60s that you might be familiar with: Benny King, Neil Sedaka, Connie Francis, Brian Hyland. The list can go on and on and on and on and on. And he had a very prolific career that spanned doing commercial hits to writing for the New York Pops to working with these great artists. He was best known, or I guess his notoriety comes from the fact that he was the arranger and orchestrator for Benny King's Stand By Me. And not only was he the arranger and orchestrator, he was the composer of the string section that is the centerpiece of that song. So anyone who's listening who's heard Stand By Me, there's an entire 64-minute long of strings. That's Stan Applebaum. So next time you hear that, you can think of my dad and think about who he was. So very well-known musician, but even broader picture, he was just an incredibly creative guy. He never wanted to stop learning or growing. The fact that he had me and my brother later in life was not abnormal for him, because he was continuing to live his life fully, his entire life, whatever that meant. So I came into the picture a few months before he turned 60. And why that's important is that inevitably, when I was 10 years old, I learned my dad was 70. For the first 10 years of my life, he was just my dad. I had no idea. I mean, but my brother burst the bubble when I was 10. I learned he was 70. And that instilled within me incredible fear, understandably, for any 10-year-old to equate my father as old. And then, and to be specific, fear of his death, which was a fear I had every day of my life from that moment until he eventually died. Of course, it got more realistic over time as life went on. And I will say he lived until his late 80s with really only minor medical problems. He never retired. He was writing music for the New York Pops in his 80s. He was driving. He was fully active. I think having a young family kept him as such. And this is all important because when he got sick, when he was diagnosed with Lewy Body Disease, which was in his early 90s, yes, there were periods when he was incredibly cognitively debilitated. And yet the flavor for his illness was very much a Groundhog Day, and that when he wasn't hallucinating, he retained his short-term memory, his long-term memory, his creativity, his zest for life. This was a man who wanted to live at least to 103. He had, I don't know why it was 103, and he would be 103 in 2025. He lived to 1 week before his 97th birthday. This was a man who never wanted to stop learning. At age 93, 94, he learned Tagalog, the language of his home health aides. He had his home health aides teach him their language so that he could communicate with them in their native language. So this was a man who was bedbound and frail, and yet fiercely intelligent, creative, and driven to maximize life. And that became a huge part of my responsibility as his caregiver. As I think about what you brought up, Marianne, about the age difference, I think I said in the book at some points, my dad and I represented the largest age differential of a patient and care partner caregiver in the ER. I mean, I came into this role for him as a dementia caregiver in my very early 30s, and he was in his early 90s, which is not usually the typical time course. And I was on the defensive the entire time. And, I've written extensively about this, but so much of what I was trying to defend, when we bring our care partners to the hospital, we're not bringing them in because they're doing well. We're bringing them in because there's something wrong. My dad was obviously not at his best. And frequently when I would bring him in, he would be having hallucinations, which for him was the most common Lewy Body Disease symptom, or he just wasn't awake or aware. And I had to really work very hard to convince the members of his passing medical teams that the person they saw in front of them, the frail, disoriented man who was 94, for example, that did not represent my dad's permanent lived reality. And I, just 3 days before many of those hospitalizations, he would be at home, we would be at the piano together, or he'd be talking about musicians that inspired him. And I really was working very hard to convince what felt like convincing members of the medical team that my dad was worthy of care and that he had quality of life outside of the hospital. One of the things that Marianne brought up is the weaving in of my dad's music into the book. So Stand By Me, as I shared, it was inspired strongly by my professional work. It is narrative nonfiction, which means that I've woven in both many cases, de-identified case examples from the thousands of caregivers I've worked with over the years, as well as my personal experience. And in writing Stand By Me, of course, an additional goal is to carry forward my dad's legacy and to keep him and his spirit alive. And one way that I've done that is each chapter has a subtitle, and the subtitle is a title of a song that he either composed or orchestrated or arranged or produced at some point in his career. And when you look at the titles, you'll see there's many of those were big hits.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, very cool. That's very cool. What a great tribute. That's really wonderful.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
I like that part.
You know, can I ask a question here? You brought up that you felt that you had to let the healthcare professionals know that your dad, who they saw in that moment, wasn't the whole of who he was, because they were seeing maybe the deficits and you wanted them to see the positives. Do you ever find in your, maybe your professional life or some of the folks that you've maybe talked about in your book, somewhat the opposite, where maybe they show up to care and they're presenting as if, like they do great on the tests, the mental status exam.
Oh, yeah.
And yet the caregiver's like, this is not how it always is. This, he's on it today. I don't know. I'm just curious. Do you find that?
Absolutely. And I think it's so great that you're shining a spotlight on the flip side of this, which is very often, it's just like, I don't understand how he just did that. He couldn't do that at home. Like, how do you all of a sudden, how are you so clear? That absolutely comes up, as does underreporting, patients not sharing the challenges they're facing. And both of these presents complexity for the family caregiver, who then feels responsible for conveying to members of the healthcare team what reality is. I often say, this is why I say to my colleagues, that caregiver in the room, that's your best friend. That person is the best source of data for you. They have a better understanding of your patient's day-to-day lived reality, symptoms as they emerge in real time, what they are and are not capable of doing, than, quite frankly, the patient often themselves, especially in the setting of dementia. So 100%, Christy, that we do see a lot of that as well. It wasn't the case for me and my dad, but for sure, many of my patients.
Yeah. I recall many times by the time my mother was, prior to when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I'd already had power of attorney and I was her healthcare advocate. So I attended her visits with her neurologist, and I always tried not to. I was always very respectful of my mom, and I tried very much to not say, no, that's not true. But there were times where the doctor would look at me and I would just tell, well, and then there's because I agree with you. Like, you have to look at the whole thing, and there's so much information that family caregivers can provide that add to nuance to the whole situation, and that can really be important, I think, and valuable. So I think when physicians and case managers see that as valuable information, and also understanding that that's also skewed, right? I mean, you don't know who's showing up at that appointment sometimes. So yeah, it's important. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, Marianne, you and I were talking before we got on about something that I think was really important, and that is in the book, you talk about the difference between that words matter, that there's caregiver and loved one, and that's a fascinating thing for me, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
I feel very passionately about this, and I'll say that the language we use around caregiving is a topic right now being discussed within the National Alliance for Caregiving here in the United States, because I think we want to align on language that is inclusive and that really does justice to what it means to be a caregiver. So I opened the book with some language that I think is not great. But one of the things that I shared is that the phrase loved one is what many of us would use to refer to our partner in care. Now, my dad was my best friend. He was a loved one. But many of us as caregivers are tasked with taking care of individuals who are not our loved ones, individuals with whom we have very difficult relationships,
Mm-hmm.
toxic, abusive relationships who we would never call a loved one. And so what I said is, I think it's important for all of us to consider what language resonates with us and to encourage those taking care of us and our care partners to use that language. And for some, it's caregiver. For some, it's partner in care or care partner. In the UK, I do some work with hospital systems in New Zealand. I know in New Zealand and Australia, they use carer, the carers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are all right. Those are all fine. The two that I'm vehemently opposed to, the first is the phrase informal caregiver. And I will disclose that early in my work, back in 2010, 2011, I used this phrase because this was the phrase that I had seen actually, quite frankly, in the dementia caregiving literature. The literature in dementia caregiving is the oldest caregiving literature out there, by the way. Cancer caregiving came around much later. And so I picked that phrase up. And then as I was going through my own experience, I realized how incredibly invalidating and dishonoring the word informal was, because there was absolutely nothing informal about anything I was doing. Yes, I was not a paid caregiver. I was not a professional, although I'd argue we all are professionals based on all the things we do. But I would say that phrase informal caregiver, we need to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And the other phrase that I speak about that I think we need to avoid is using the word caretaker to refer to caregivers. This is very commonly used, and by definition, a caretaker is someone who oversees property, land, or animals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I guess in some ways we oversee care, but that to me feels also quite demeaning. Mm-hmm. And there's something energetically when I think about the word caregiver within that word is the word give. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do as caregivers. We give of ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially. We're not taking anything. Right. Yeah. So I think there's some language that really we can do without.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important and really, really powerful. I know for me, this is something I share when I'm talking to groups too about, and I've stopped using the term loved one because I realize that, as you said, not everyone, people come to this, and it's admirable how people are willing to take on some responsibilities, some duties, some aspects of caregiving when they've had this fractured relationship. And I think of friends of mine who have had very difficult relationships with parents and are feeling a lot of resentment about, and here I am again. Here I am again doing this. And I took care of her when she was an alcoholic and I was a teenager, and here I am again. And yet, so I kind of lean in, I tend to say your person, who's your person that you're caregiving for. But I think, caregiving, caretaking, great distinctions. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And it's really powerful. Yeah.
In other words that I think are questionable is when people refer to those with dementia as suffering or nightmare, horrific, hell. Many people with dementia will tell you, I am not suffering. My family might be suffering, but I'm not. And I think people tend to forget that there's also joy and there can be happiness within these moments. It's not all doom and gloom. And that's kind of the stigma that's attached to it. That's what I think people immediately think of when they hear that somebody has dementia, that it's just this horrific thing, but it might not be. I mean, there are some people who go throughout the entire course of the illness and it's not that bad. And they'll tell us that. We have books in our collection that will tell you that. It's, they don't have rose-colored glasses on, but for some people, the person they cared for was, amiable and likable, and it was sad, and there were challenges, but it wasn't hell.
And I imagine you pointed this out that in many cases that might be a projection of the caregiver's own experience, because in many situations it is more difficult for us as family caregivers. I think there was, I'm not making light of any element of my dad's illness, but he wasn't necessarily always aware of what was happening to him medically when he was hallucinating. And I think that, quite frankly, provided a protective buffer for him at times. Right. It was intensely painful for me. It was suffering for me. It was traumatic for me, but it wasn't always for him. And I think that's a real gift.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you
Yeah.
to look at it that way too. Well, most people just don't have enough supports, and A, they don't have supports, or B, if they do have supports, but they just don't want to accept them because, so many people want to be in control. And if you sign your name to the papers, then the way the law works, you can't assign tasks to other people, certain tasks and things. Because I know I experienced that too. And people would say, well, why don't you have your brother do that? No, they can't. Then my name is on the piece of paper that makes me the authority to speak for my mom. So he can't call up and ask questions and do things. He just can't do it, which isn't helpful. And people don't realize that when they sign those papers to be like power of attorney or healthcare proxy, you're not thinking about that, the fact that it does all fall on you, and maybe why can't there be more than one person so that somebody else can share the load? That's a flaw in the system.
So, and speaking to that, then, do you have recommendations or thoughts you would share with folks about navigating sibling or like there's a family of people who might be giving care or whatever, and there you can bump up against a lot of stuff there. I'm sure I would imagine that those are topics that get shared in your work. And so, do you have any thoughts on that? Like how would you? I don't know. Do you have any recommendations on that aspect?
Yeah, communicate. I think, what's really important is realizing when there is a situation where it's not a caregiver in isolation and there is a family network, whether that's siblings or aunties and uncles or whoever else is around, that there needs to be open communication with every member in the care network. And as long as the patient is cognitively capable of engaging in those conversations, that patient should also be involved in those conversations. And those conversations should be happening as early as possible. I think a lot of what I've done in Stand By Me is provided very specific communication tips and tools to help guide conversations that caregivers should be having early, ranging from discussing quality of life and what that means to the patient and goals of care, to financial planning and understanding what insurance is available and what resources available to pay for care should insurance run out. These are conversations that are conversations for the family. I put in quotes because family, it doesn't need to be blood family. It's for the care network, whoever is involved. And so, I think that the more discussion can happen from the start, it sets a precedent for open communication around healthcare and caregiving. It then allows ideally for greater communication down the line when there are transitions in care and healthcare decisions that need to be made. While yes, one person is often identified as the healthcare proxy, we all know that healthcare decisions are not made in a vacuum. And that healthcare proxy is making a decision against a backdrop if there is a care network within that care network. And that's why, just open discussions early on is important, and repeat it. This is something I talk about again in the book, the importance of repeated conversation about goals of care. I think back and my dad and I started talking about goals of care probably when I was like 15 years old, just because that's the nature of our relationship. We often would talk about death and what we thought would happen after and what was important to him. But, I think back to when I first stepped in formally as his healthcare proxy. I was taking care of him for a few years beforehand. My mother, unfortunately, died very suddenly the year after his diagnosis of Lewy Body Disease. And I stepped in formally to serve in all these ways. And I had repeated conversations with him at that point about what his goals of care were. And then I repeated those conversations again and again. And I'm grateful that I did, because had I not, I would have been relying at the point of his death on stated goals of care from 2014, which were moot in 2019. Had I not had those conversations, it would have been very difficult for me to eventually bring his voice into the room at the time that he died. And he did die in the hospital.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. I say early and often.
Good. Yeah, we're aligned.
Right. I mean, because situations change. There are developments in healthcare. There are different opportunities that have become available, and if we are locked into something and not open to revisiting, then you're right. We're then not being present to what's really happening. And that's really important, I think. So that's so great. That's really great. Thank you. Are there things that you want to share with us that maybe we didn't ask you the question you were hoping for, or something you wanted to share with us that you want people to know?
Sure. And this touches on something that Marianne brought up around the fact that it's not all bad. And I think, Marianne, you were referencing this for the patient, but a very significant portion of my scientific work over the past 15 years is in exploring the opportunity that caregivers have to experience meaning and purpose despite the challenges and suffering of caregiving. And I want to be very clear when I say this, I am not talking about the power of positive thinking or turning lemons to lemonade. It's not who I am as a human, as a therapist, as a researcher. But I have found in my research and clinical practice, and certainly in my own personal caregiving journey, that despite intense suffering, that we can capitalize on the challenges of caregiving as opportunities to learn new things about ourselves, to grow, to expand our vision of what's important in our life, refine our goals for the future, enhance a relationship with a care partner, heal a relationship or not, but at least move forward with less regret or guilt. So I think there's incredible opportunity. Most of us, the National Alliance for Caregiving would say that, a little under 50% of caregivers choose the role. I would say that most of the people who come to see me felt like they had zero choice in becoming a caregiver. I certainly felt like I had no choice. It was not a choice for me. And while that's the case for most of us, we don't choose to become caregivers. We don't choose to have our care partners, loved ones be diagnosed with an illness. We can choose how we face the day-to-day. And I think that there are many opportunities for us as caregivers to reflect on how we choose to engage and to delegate and to capitalize on the time we have that can be incredibly meaningful. I've developed a psychotherapy. It's called meaning-centered psychotherapy for caregivers that explicitly gives caregivers the tools that they need to connect to meaning despite suffering. I talk a little bit about that in the 9th chapter of the book. But just to say that there's a handful of us doing this work, and it's, again, not negating suffering, doesn't take away the burden, doesn't take away the distress, but it does allow for growth. And I would imagine those of you listening who are no longer actively taking care of someone, that you can reflect back and think about ways in which you have grown. You have maybe found your voice through caregiving. Maybe you are someone who can multitask now in your day job because you had to do that as a caregiver. So there's some benefits.
Yeah, there are so many of the authors of the books in our collection that wrote their book, after their experience had come to its natural conclusion, and realized how much they've learned and decided to write the book that they wish they had when they were on their journey.
Yeah.
And the benefits and the blessings that, a lot of people realize. And some of the books are written in real time, and some of them are written soon after it's over. But like some of them are written, years and maybe a decade or more, when people have really had time to think about it. And there are also people who have willingly gone into another caregiving situation after they've been through something, traumatic and dramatic in their life changing. So, they learn and grow from that. So that's been one of the, I think, the predominant messages that we get through the authors, that we have over 400 authors in our collection. So then we hear that over and over and over again.
I would add too, I think not only did I grow in so many ways, my children, they just really rose to this challenge, and they learned compassion in real time. And they were old enough that we could talk about it enough that they really, they were so great with my parents. And I think they look back on that time as they learned so much, and it was a gift that they were able to be with them. Yeah. And who they are now, they were always, of course, amazing children, but this time period gave them, we always want to shelter our kids, but I think that they really who they are now has been impacted by that. And that's a beautiful thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, Christy
Absolutely.
focuses a lot on children in the caregiving role. And when we first started as authors, we were, we have many, many kids' books, beautiful children's books, illustrated, all along the whole age
That's wonderful.
spectrum,
Yeah, it's
all the
great.
way from, books for very young readers into young adult fiction. And people have said, well, why do we children need to have books? And it's like, but children are there on the journey. No matter, even
Often
if
they
you
are.
don't, if they're not by your side, if you're taking care of your mom every night after work and make sure she's okay, you're not home with your kid. And your kid wants to know why. So
Yeah.
they're there too.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing. The whole family gets involved. I was going to ask one more quick question.
Yeah.
Based upon your experience with all of these different caregivers, what would you see as like the predominant issue that caregivers face?
There's so many, but if there's one commonality among every caregiver I've worked with clinically, I've known in my own experience across illnesses, it's the fact that we as caregivers have to sit with uncertainty. That doing so is incredibly difficult. Not being able to necessarily plan for the next year or month or week or day, or when my dad was hallucinating, it was the next hour. That is incredibly challenging, and it very much shapes the emotional, psychological experience of caregiving. And so I would say that is one of the most common drivers of distress in folks who seek support with us.
Yeah.
Right. And also the uncertainty of whether or not you feel you're doing a good job. I think people are uncertain. No, because nobody's prepared. There's no class you can take. There's no instruction manual. It changes every day. People are constantly second guessing themselves and maybe feel like they failed. We hear that too.
Yeah.
We hear that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. I know when I was caring for my mother and her husband, I just felt, then I was far away too, so I wasn't right there in the middle of it all the time. But you never know what was going to happen from day to day. What calamity was going to strike, or what issue
Every day
was
is an adventure.
Yeah, what issue, suddenly you get a phone call and you're at work and somebody's harassing you for something that they need, like from the nursing home or whatever. And just seeing the phone number come up on your phone,
Traumatic.
you're
yeah.
like, what happened now? Why are they calling me now? Oh, we just want to give him a flu shot. Can he have a flu shot? Oh yeah, that's great. But I mean, are you calling to tell me that he passed away?
Sure.
So unbelievable. But go on, Christy. You had something.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you so much. But as you were talking about the uncertainty thing, I was reminded, I sort of, not to be irreverent, but I always say, buy the travel insurance, because if you're going to take that trip that you need, that's great. But buy that travel insurance, because I didn't buy it before. But then we did take a family vacation before. And I'm like, to my husband, I just said, we may need to change these at the last minute.
Always get the travel insurance. I lost track of the number of canceled trips. I stopped making the reservations.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's hard. Thank you so much. This has been really great. I think what you're putting out there is so important for not only in your book, but what you're doing is so important for people who are listening to this podcast, who read our books. And also for affiliated professionals who are hopefully starting to take notice of some of this. I hope that that's also a growth area, that family practitioners, people who are just in health fields can start to see how much caregiving in our country is, first of all, on the backs of families. And so how are we supporting them? And that's really important. Really important.
It's, I'll just share. So I recently left Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and joined the faculty of the Mount Sinai Health System in New York, where I'm directing the new Center for Caregiving. And part of the mission of this center and my work is to ensure that every healthcare system has a caregivers clinical service like the one that I developed at Sloan Kettering, that this should become a standard of care. And so that's really where my energy is being put right now. And I also think bringing it into thinking about family practitioners, when you do your annual visits and wellness visits, caregiving status should be collected every year because it is a social determinant of health. If you are a caregiver, it is affecting every aspect of your life. And the earlier we can identify caregivers and track outcomes, the better placed we're going to be to eventually be able to support caregivers. So I think we just need a big shift. And I think we're on a precipice of a lot of positive change and momentum to support caregivers right now.
Well, I think in the last presidential campaign, one of the candidates spoke about making Medicare pay for care.
It's true.
That's
well,
true.
Just even the term sandwich generation is starting to be mentioned more and more. And that's that's all in that area. And it's so true. And women in particular, many times are also going, like for me, looking at sandwich generation moms, they're also going through their own shifts with menopause. And, that's what I call the trifecta, right?
Yeah, triple whammy.
Kids, parents, menopause. So that's always a recommendation. Be sure you tell your primary care doc, here's where I'm at. This is what's going on. That's really great. I think that's great. And I am so glad that you sound so hopeful because I think that that's something we'd all love to see and really champion. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Where can people find your book?
The book can be found anywhere where books are sold. Amazon's a great place to get it, as is the Simon & Schuster website. You could go to my website, which is AllisonApplebaum.com, to learn more about the book. I've also embedded within the website some audio of all the songs of my dad's that I reference in the book if you want to take a listen, and where you can keep up to date with any events that I'm doing around the country.
Okay, and you can find it on allsauthors.com. under Allison's blog post, which we encourage you to take the time to read to learn more about her story. Thank you so much. It was lovely to meet you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Mary Ann with exciting news. Alls Authors has published a brand new anthology, Poetry for the Dementia Journey, now available in ebook and paperback through Amazon. Within its pages, you'll discover a variety of voices writing about the diversity of dementia care experiences, caring for a mother or father or spouse, witnessing the decline of a sibling, reflections on the time before the diagnosis, the years of care, and the aftermath. Poetry provides us with a meaningful way to explore our experience and emotions regarding dementia and to express ourselves when we encounter the many different joys and dilemmas caregiving can bring. You'll find details on how to order the book in the show notes. Please remember to leave a review on the book sales page once you've read it. Reviews do help boost a book's visibility and helps readers find it. Thank you for your support of our efforts to erase the silence and stigma that often accompany a dementia diagnosis.
Caregiving is a challenge, whether your person has dementia or not. Finding helpful tips and learning new strategies from people in the know is critical. That's why we at Alls Authors love the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast from Elizabeth Miller, who also happens to be an Alls author. Elizabeth speaks from experience and has important and often fun conversations with other caregiving experts and professionals. And we appreciate learning tips on self-care, discovering new resources, and feeling empowered to support ourselves as caregivers. You can find the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast wherever you download your favorite podcasts, or visit the website happyhealthycaregiver.com.